The winter of 1879 came down on the Wyoming territory like a fist, and it was that same winter that nearly took Susan Langley's life on a stretch of frozen trail, no wider than a wagon wheel. Before a silent cowboy named Gilbert Ramsey found her buried to her knees in snow and carried her home without saying a single word. She had been traveling 3 days by stagecoach out of Cheyenne when the storm rolled down from the Laramie Mountains, thick and sudden, the kind of storm that old-timers spoke of in low voices around stove fires. The driver, a weathered man named Cobb, had tried to outrun it, pushing the horses hard along the pass road toward the town of Bitter Creek, but the wind came sideways and the snow turned the world white in every direction, and somewhere along a steep grade, the front wheel caught a buried rock and the coach tipped hard onto its side. Susan remembered the screaming of the horses more than anything else. She remembered being thrown against the door, the crack of her elbow against the frame, and then the terrible silence that followed, broken only by the wind and the low moaning of one of the other passengers, an elderly preacher named Mr. Abernathy who had struck his head. There had been 4 of them inside the coach besides herself, and Cobb outside on the box, and in the chaos that followed, with the horses tangled and thrashing and the storm growing worse by the minute, someone had suggested that a search for shelter was their only chance, since the coach could not be righted and none of them could say how far it was to the next relay station. It was a decision made in panic, and it was the wrong one, though none of them knew it at the time. Susan had wandered from the wreck with Cobb and one other passenger, a cattle buyer from Omaha, in search of a light or a trail marker, while Mr. Abernathy and the remaining 2 passengers stayed huddled inside the overturned coach with blankets and what warmth the horses' bodies could still give. Within an hour, in the white blindness of the storm, Susan had lost sight of Cobb and the cattle buyer entirely. She had called out until her voice gave up, and then she had simply walked, because to stop walking, she understood with a clarity that frightened her, was to die. She did not know how many hours passed. She did not know when her feet stopped feeling the ground beneath them, or when the cold stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like something softer, something almost like sleep reaching up through the snow to take her. She only knew that at some point her legs would no longer carry her weight, and she went down into a drift beside a stand of leafless cottonwoods, and the last clear thought she had was of her father's face, and of the letter in her coat pocket that named a man she had never met, a man named Edgar Thorne, whom she had crossed half a country to marry, because there had been no other road left open to her. Gilbert Ramsey found her less than a quarter-mile from where she fell. He had been out since before dawn, riding the low pasture fence line of his ranch to check for cattle that might have drifted with the storm, because a man who lost cattle in a blizzard lost his whole years living along with them, and Gilbert Ramsey had already lost enough in his 29 years that he was not inclined to lose more if he could help it. He was a broad-shouldered man, quiet by nature and quieter still since the winter 2 years past when his wife Mary had died, bringing their son into a world that the boy himself never lived long enough to see. Since then Gilbert had kept to himself and to his cattle, and to the long silences of his small ranch house 6 miles outside of Bitter Creek, and the townsfolk had grown used to him being a man of few words, the kind of man who tipped his hat and said his business and rode on. It was his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Duke, that first caught the strange shape in the snow, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring at a scent that was not cattle. Gilbert had nearly ridden past it, taking it for a drift shaped by wind the way drifts sometimes shape themselves into strange mounds, but something in the way Duke balked made him rein in and look twice, and it was on the second look that he saw the dark wool of a coat sleeve poking through the white, and beneath it, unmistakably, the curve of a gloved hand. He was off his horse before he had finished thinking it through. He dug with his bare hands, tearing his gloves off because they slowed him, and the cold bit into his fingers as he cleared the snow away from her face, and what he found was a young woman, her lips gone the color of a bruise, her lashes crusted white with frost, her chest rising and falling so shallowly that for one long, terrible moment he was certain he had come too late. He pressed 2 fingers beneath her jaw the way he had once been taught by an army surgeon during his years scouting for the cavalry, and he found a pulse there, faint and fluttering like a bird's heartbeat, but present. Alive. She was alive. Gilbert Ramsey did not shout for joy, because that was not his way, and there was no one out there in the white wilderness to hear him even if he had. He simply worked. He stripped off his heavy sheepskin coat and wrapped it around her, tucking it beneath her body as best he could, and he lifted her against his chest the way a man lifts something he is afraid of breaking, and he carried her to Duke and settled her before him in the saddle, holding her close with one arm while he gathered the reins with the other. The ride back to the ranch house took the better part of an hour, though it felt to Gilbert like the longest hour of his life. Longer even than the hour he had spent outside Mary's door listening to her cries 2 winters past, waiting for a birth that would end in silence instead of celebration. He held the stranger against his chest and felt the terrible stillness of her, the way her head lolled against his shoulder, and he found himself murmuring low words to her, not even sure what he was saying, only that some instinct told him a person clinging to the edge of life needed a voice to hold on to. Even a stranger's voice, even the voice of a man who had forgotten, these past 2 years, how to speak much to anyone at all. He did not know her name. He did not ask himself who she was, or where she had come from, or why a young woman in city clothes and thin leather boots had been walking alone through a mountain, blizzard 6 miles from the nearest ranch house. Those questions could wait. What could not wait was warmth, and shelter, and the fire he needed to get burning the moment he carried her through his own front door. The ranch house was a modest structure of hewn log and plank, 2 rooms below and a loft above, built by Gilbert's own hands the year he had married Mary, back when the future had still seemed like a bright and simple thing. He kicked the door open with his boot and carried Susan Langley, though he did not yet know that was her name, straight to the bed in the front room, the one that had been his marriage bed and that he had slept in alone for 2 long years, and he laid her down upon it as gently as a man lays down something made of glass. Then he built up the fire until the small room roared with heat, and he stripped off her frozen coat and her sodden gloves and her ruined boots, working with the brisk efficiency of a man who had doctored sick calves and broken-legged horses more times than he could count, though his hands trembled slightly as he did it, because this was no calf and no horse but a living woman whose life seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads. He wrapped her in every blanket the house possessed. He heated water and pressed warmed cloths to her hands and feet, working the color back into her fingers inch by patient inch, watching for the black and waxy look of frostbite that would mean the loss of a finger or worse, and finding, to his relief, only the angry red of cold burned skin that would heal in time. He did not touch her beyond what was necessary. He was a careful man, a decent man, and even with her senseless and unable to know one way or the other, he was mindful of what was proper and what was not, and so he left her boots and stockings removed but her dress in place, and worked only at warming what needed warming. By the time the sun set that first evening, swallowed early by the still raging storm outside, Susan Langley had not opened her eyes, but her breathing had steadied, and a faint color had come back into her cheeks, and Gilbert Ramsey sat in a chair beside his own bed, watching over a stranger through the long hours of the night, feeding the fire and waiting, the way he had once waited outside another door, hoping this time for a different ending. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn, leaving the world outside buried under 3 feet of new snow, silent and gleaming and utterly impassable. Gilbert knew there would be no riding to town, not for several days at least, not until the drifts settled enough for a horse to break trail through them. That meant whatever was to be done for the woman in his bed would have to be done by his own 2 hands, at least until the roads opened. He had never been a praying man in any regular way, not since Mary, but that first night, sitting in the hard wooden chair with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the stranger's pale, still face, Gilbert Ramsey found himself asking whatever God might still be listening to let this one live. She did not wake on the second day either, though she stirred sometimes, murmuring words that made no sense, fragments of names and places, and once she cried out something that sounded like Papa, in a voice so raw with grief that it made Gilbert's chest ache in a way he had not felt since his own losses. He spooned warm broth between her lips when he could rouse her enough to swallow, made from a hen he killed and boiled down that same morning, and he changed the cloths on her forehead when the fever came, for a fever did come, rising up out of the cold's aftermath the way it so often did, the body fighting its own battle even after the immediate danger of freezing had passed. By the third day, worried that the fever would not break, and that his own limited doctoring would not be enough, Gilbert made the decision to ride the 6 miles into Bitter Creek despite the deep snow, breaking trail slowly with Duke laboring beneath him, to fetch the one person in the territory he trusted to know what to do. That person was Mrs. Odell, a widow of some 60 years who had served as midwife and healer to half the ranches within 20 miles of Bitter Creek for the better part of 3 decades, and who had been present, though it had done no good in the end, on the night Mary died. Mrs. Odell did not ask many questions when Gilbert appeared at her door, snow-crusted and grim, and told her only that he had found a woman near dead on the trail and needed her help. She was already pulling on her coat and gathering her bag of remedies before he had finished the sentence. "You did right to come for me, Gilbert Ramsey," she said, climbing up behind him on Duke's broad back with the ease of a woman who had spent her whole life on horseback. "A fever after a chill like that can turn ugly fast if it is not watched proper. You are certain you do not know who she is?" "No, ma'am," Gilbert said. "Found her a quarter-mile off the trail, half buried. Reckon she must have come off that stage that never made it in from Cheyenne. Folks in town were asking after it before the snow got too deep to send a search party." Mrs. Odell's face tightened at that. "There was talk of it, yes. Cobb's coach. 4 passengers besides him, they said, and a preacher man among them. If she come off that wrecked child, she is fortunate indeed to be breathing at all." They rode back to the ranch mostly in silence after that, the snow crunching beneath Duke's hooves, and when they arrived Mrs. Odell went straight to the bedside and set to work with the brisk, practiced hands of a woman who had brought half the territory's children into the world and eased half its old folks out of it. She examined Susan's hands and feet for lasting damage, pressed her ear to the young woman's chest to listen for the wet rattle of pneumonia, and pronounced, after a long and careful examination, that the girl would likely live, provided the fever broke within the next day or two and provided she did not develop a lung sickness from the cold. "She is strong," Mrs. Odell said, straightening up and looking at Gilbert with an expression he could not quite read. "Stronger than she looks, I would wager." "You did well by her, Gilbert. Better than most men would have thought to do." Gilbert only nodded, uncomfortable as always with anything that sounded like praise, and asked what more needed doing. For 2 more days Mrs. Odell stayed at the ranch, sleeping on a cot she had Gilbert set up near the fire, both to nurse Susan, and though neither of them said it aloud, to see to the proprieties of an unmarried woman being cared for in an unmarried man's house. She spooned broth and willow bark tea into Susan at intervals through the fever's worst hours, and she and Gilbert took turns sitting up through the nights, and it was in the deep hours of the 5th night since the wreck, with the fire burned low and the wind finally quiet outside, that Susan Langley opened her eyes for the first time and looked, with dazed and frightened confusion, upon a world she had not expected to see again. She saw first the low log ceiling above her, dark with age and smoke, and then the flickering orange light of a fire she did not recognize. And then, turning her head with great effort, she saw an old woman dozing in a chair nearby, and beyond her, in the shadows near the door, the tall shape of a man standing with his hat in his hands, watching her with an intensity that might have frightened her had she the strength left to feel much of anything at all. "Where?" Susan managed, her voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the small room. "Where am I, Mrs.?" Odell startled awake at the sound and was at her side in an instant, pressing a cool hand to Susan's forehead and murmuring reassurances. But it was the man by the door who answered her question, stepping forward at last into the firelight so she could see him properly for the first time. "You are at my ranch, ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and rough, as though unused from long disuse. "Name is Gilbert Ramsey. Found you on the trail near 5 days back, half buried in the snow. This here is Mrs. Odell, come to nurse you through the fever." Susan stared at him for a long moment, taking in the weathered lines of his face, the dark eyes that regarded her with a wary sort of gentleness, the broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway behind him, and something in her chest loosened, some tight and terrified thing that had been coiled inside her since the moment the stagecoach tipped over into the snow. "The others," she whispered. "The stagecoach. There were others with me. Mr. Abernathy and Cobb and—" "Rest easy now," Mrs. Odell said gently, pressing a cup of water to Susan's lips. "There will be time enough for all that once you have your strength back. For now you must rest, child. You have been very ill." Susan wanted to protest, wanted to demand answers about the fate of the people she had traveled with, but the effort of speaking even those few words had exhausted her, and before she could form another sentence, sleep pulled her back under, though this time it was an ordinary, healing sleep, not the terrible near-death stillness of before. It was 2 more days before Susan Langley was strong enough to sit up and take food properly, and in that time word had finally reached Bitter Creek, carried by a rancher who had ridden through on his way to check his own stock, that a search party had at last managed to reach the wrecked stagecoach. The news was a mixture of relief and sorrow. Cobb the driver and the cattle buyer from Omaha had been found alive, having taken shelter in a line shack they stumbled upon in the storm, half frozen themselves, but alive. Mr. Abernathy, the preacher, had also survived, along with 1 other passenger, huddled in the overturned coach itself, though the old man had lost 2 fingers to the frost. But there had been a 5th passenger unaccounted for, a young woman traveling alone from Cheyenne, and the search party had found no trace of her at all, and had begun to fear the worst. When Gilbert rode into Bitter Creek to fetch supplies and to send word that the missing woman had in fact been found and was recovering at his ranch, the news spread through the small town like fire through dry grass. Bitter Creek was not a large place, perhaps 400 souls counting the ranches scattered around it, with a single main street holding a general store, a saloon, a small white church, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office, and news of any kind traveled fast in a place so small. By the time Gilbert had finished his business at the general store, half the town seemed to know that the Ramsey widower had pulled a half-dead woman out of a snowdrift and was nursing her back to health out at his ranch, and the whispers that followed him down the street were not entirely unkind, but they were curious and speculative, in the way that small towns always were about anything touching on romance or scandal. Sheriff Nate Boone, a lean and weathered man who had held his post in Bitter Creek for close to a decade, stopped Gilbert outside the store to ask after the details and to inform him that a telegram had already been sent to Cheyenne to notify the young woman's kin, or whoever had arranged her passage, that she had survived. "Did she say who she was traveling to meet?" Boone asked, tucking his thumbs into his gun belt. "Cobb mentioned she had a letter on her, addressed to some fellow in Cheyenne. Said something about a marriage arrangement, though he wasn't rightly sure of the particulars." Gilbert's jaw tightened slightly at that, though he could not have said why the news struck him the way it did. "She has not spoken much of her business," he said carefully. "Been too poorly to ask, and I did not figure it was my place to pry." "Well," Boone said, "someone ought to let this fellow in Cheyenne know she is alive, whoever he is. Wouldn't be right to leave a man thinking his intended bride died in a snowbank if she did not." Gilbert agreed, of course, because it was the only decent thing to agree to. But he rode back to his ranch that afternoon with a strange, unfamiliar weight sitting in his chest, one he did not examine too closely, though it stayed with him through the cold ride home and lingered still when he stepped through his own front door and found Susan Langley sitting up in his bed. Color returned to her cheeks, watching him with tired but clear blue eyes. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, and her voice, though still weak, was steadier now than it had been. "Mrs. Odell tells me I owe you my life." Gilbert set down the sack of flour and coffee he had carried in from town and stood awkwardly near the door, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when he did not know quite what to do with himself. "You do not owe me anything, ma'am. Any decent person would have done the same, finding you like that." "I do not believe that is entirely true," Susan said, "but I thank you all the same. My name is Susan Langley." "I do not believe I have had the chance to properly introduce myself, given the circumstances." Something in the careful formality of it, the way she extended her hand slightly from beneath the quilts as though they were meeting at a church social rather than in the aftermath of her near death, brought the ghost of a smile to Gilbert's mouth, the first real smile Mrs. Odell had seen cross his face in longer than she cared to think about. "Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Langley," he said, and stepped forward just far enough to take her offered hand briefly in his own rough, weathered one. "Glad to see you looking more yourself." Over the following days, as the snow slowly began to melt from the roads and Susan's strength returned bit by bit, a careful and quiet friendship began to grow between them, built in the small moments of an ordinary life shared under extraordinary circumstances. Mrs. Odell remained at the ranch through it all, both to complete Susan's recovery and to preserve the proprieties, sleeping in the front room while Susan occupied the bed and Gilbert took to sleeping in the small loft above, though he was rarely there for long, being a man who rose before dawn out of long habit to see to his cattle and his chores. It was during those slow, healing days that Susan told them both, a little at a time, the story of how she had come to be on that stagecoach at all. Her father, she explained, had been a shopkeeper in a small town in Ohio, a good man but not a careful one with money, and when he died of a sudden fever the previous autumn, he had left behind debts that swallowed the shop and the house along with it. Susan, 22 years old and with no other family to turn to, no brothers or sisters, her mother long since passed, had found herself with almost nothing to her name and precious few respectable paths open to a woman alone in the world. "There is a newspaper," she explained one evening, sitting near the fire wrapped in a shawl Mrs. Odell had lent her, her strength returned enough now to sit up properly and even to help a little with small chores around the house. "A matrimonial paper, they call it. Men out west place advertisements for wives, and women in my circumstances answer them. I know how it must sound." "Does not sound like much of anything to me," Gilbert said quietly from where he sat mending a piece of harness by the fire, "except a hard thing for a woman to have to do, having so few other choices left to her." Susan looked at him with something like surprise and gratitude mixed together. "That is kinder than most people's judgment of it," she said. "There was a man, Edgar Thorne, a merchant in Cheyenne, who wrote to me after I placed my own notice describing my situation. His letters were proper enough. He described a comfortable house, a respectable business. He sent the fare for my passage west, and I told myself it was a sensible arrangement, a practical solution to an impossible problem. I did not let myself think too hard about whether it was also a lonely one." "And now?" Mrs. Odell asked gently, looking up from her knitting. Susan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Now I do not know what I think," she admitted. "I have never met the man. I know him only through a handful of letters, each one more concerned with what I could bring to his household than with who I might actually be. I agreed to the arrangement because I saw no other way forward. A woman alone, with no money and no family, has very few respectable roads open to her in this world, Mr. Ramsey. Marriage, even to a stranger, seemed the safest of the poor choices available to me. Gilbert set down his mending and looked at her, and something in his dark eyes made Susan's breath catch slightly, though she could not have said exactly why. "Seems to me," he said slowly, "that a woman ought to have more choices than that. Seems like an injustice, if you ask me, that the world narrows down so hard on women left alone, when it does not narrow so hard on men in the same fix." It was not a long speech, not for most men, but it was among the longest Gilbert Ramsey had spoken at once in longer than he could remember, and the sincerity in it struck Susan more deeply than any polished words from Edgar Thorne's letters ever had. The days that followed brought Susan fully back to health, and with her returning strength came a returning restlessness, an awareness that she could not remain indefinitely under Gilbert Ramsey's roof, however grateful she was for his care and however comfortable, in a strange and unexpected way, she had come to feel there. Mrs. Odell, satisfied at last that the danger had fully passed, returned to her own small house in Bitter Creek, though she made a point of riding out every few days to check on Susan's progress, both out of genuine concern and, Gilbert suspected, out of simple curiosity about how things stood between the widower and his unexpected guest. Susan began to help around the ranch house in those weeks, unable to bear the idea of sitting idle, while Gilbert worked from before dawn until well after dark tending his small herd and mending fences damaged by the winter storms. She swept and cooked and mended, tasks she had learned well enough growing up in her father's house, and though her hands were softer than a ranch woman's and her manner still carried the polish of a shopkeeper's educated daughter, she took to the work with a determination that Gilbert found himself admiring more with each passing day. He taught her, one bright cold afternoon, how to milk the single dairy cow he kept for his own use, laughing softly, a rare and rusty sound, when she yelped at the animal's tail swatting her across the face. He showed her how to bank the fire properly so it would hold through the long nights, and how to read the sky for signs of coming weather, knowledge that any ranch wife needed to survive the isolation of frontier life. And in turn, Susan told him stories of her childhood in Ohio, of her father's shop and the customers who used to come in for ribbon and thread, of the small pleasures of a settled town life that Gilbert, who had come west as a young man following the promise of cheap land after the war, had never known. It was during one such evening, the two of them sitting on the porch step despite the cold because Susan had wanted to see the stars, which she said burned brighter and more numerous out here than they ever had back home, that Gilbert finally spoke to her of his own losses, something he had not done with another living soul since the day Mary was buried. "Had a wife," he said quietly, staring out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the star-scattered sky. "Mary. We were married 4 years. She died bringing our son into the world 2 winters back now. Boy did not live but a few hours past her." Susan's hand found his in the darkness, a small and instinctive gesture of comfort, and she did not pull it away even after she felt him go still at the touch. "I am so sorry, Gilbert," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "That is a terrible grief to carry." "Reckon I have gotten used to carrying it," he said. "Though I will admit these past weeks with you here, it has sat lighter on me than it has in a long while." Neither of them said anything more that night about what those words might mean, but something had shifted between them. Some careful boundary had been quietly crossed, and both of them felt it, though neither was yet ready to name it aloud. It was nearly 3 weeks after the stagecoach wreck, with the worst of the winter's snow finally melting into the mud of an early thaw, that the letter arrived which would threaten to unravel everything that had begun to bloom, so quietly and so carefully, between Susan Langley and Gilbert Ramsey. The letter came by way of the stage that finally resumed its regular route through Bitter Creek, delivered to the general store, and from there carried out to the ranch by a young boy Gilbert paid a nickel to run errands when needed. It was addressed to Miss Susan Langley, care of the town of Bitter Creek, and the return address named Edgar Thorne of Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, and Gilbert, standing nearby pretending to busy himself with mending a bridle, watched her face carefully as she read, though he said nothing, not trusting himself to speak calmly about a man he had never met but had already, somewhere in the private corners of his heart, begun to resent. The letter, when Susan finished reading it aloud in a flat and careful voice, revealed Edgar Thorne to be a man of considerable coldness. He wrote of having heard, through the newspaper accounts of the rescued stagecoach passengers, that Miss Langley had survived her ordeal and was recovering at a ranch outside Bitter Creek. He expressed relief at this news, though the relief seemed, even in Susan's careful reading, to be more practical than heartfelt, more concerned with the fulfillment of an arrangement than with genuine feeling for her well-being. He reminded her, in language that made Gilbert's jaw clench tight with restrained anger, that he had already paid her passage west at considerable expense, and that he expected her, once sufficiently recovered, to complete her journey to Cheyenne to fulfill the terms of their agreement. He noted that a respectable household required a mistress, and that his patience, though considerable, was not without limit. "He speaks of me," Susan said quietly, folding the letter with hands that had gone very still, "as though I were a delayed shipment of goods rather than a person." "You are not obligated to go," Gilbert said, more sharply than he intended, and then, softening, added, "Forgive me. It is not my place to tell you what you are or are not obligated to do." "No," Susan said, looking up at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "I think perhaps it is exactly your place, Gilbert Ramsey, though I could not have said so with any confidence 3 weeks ago." They did not speak further of the letter that evening, but it hung over the ranch house like a shadow in the days that followed, and Susan found herself turning the question over and over in her mind late into the night, unable to sleep. She had agreed, in a moment of desperation and practicality, to marry a man she had never met, because it had seemed the only sensible path forward for a woman with nothing and no one. But she had not, in that moment of agreement, anticipated Gilbert Ramsey, had not anticipated the quiet steadiness of him, the gentleness in his rough hands, the way her heart had begun, slowly and against all her careful practicality, to belong to him instead. The matter came to a head faster than either of them expected. Edgar Thorne, it turned out, was not a man inclined to wait patiently for a reply to his letter. Barely a week after it arrived, word reached Bitter Creek by way of the stage driver that a well-dressed stranger had arrived in town asking after the whereabouts of the Ramsey Ranch. A man who gave his name as Edgar Thorne of Cheyenne, and who made no secret of his business, announcing to anyone who would listen at the general store that he had come to collect his intended bride. Sheriff Boone, hearing of the stranger's arrival and his loudly stated intentions, rode out to the Ramsey Ranch himself to give Gilbert and Susan fair warning, arriving just as the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. "Thought you two ought to know," Boone said, dismounting stiffly and nodding to Susan, who had come out onto the porch at the sound of hoofbeats. "Fellow calling himself Edgar Thorne is in town, staying at the hotel, and he is telling anyone who will listen that Miss Langley here owes him a debt of passage and a promise of marriage, and that he intends to collect on both before he returns to Cheyenne." Susan's face went pale, but her chin lifted with a determination that Gilbert had come to recognize and admire in the weeks since he had found her half frozen on the trail. "I owe Mr. Thorne nothing but the return of whatever money he spent on my passage," she said firmly, "and that I intend to repay in full, once I am able. But I made him no binding promise of marriage, only an agreement to travel west and meet him, with the understanding that either of us might reconsider once we had done so. I have reconsidered, Sheriff Boone, and I will tell him so myself." Boone nodded slowly, clearly relieved to hear the matter stated so plainly. That is my understanding of how these matrimonial arrangements generally work as well, miss, though I will confess I am no expert on the particulars. There is no legal marriage contract binding you to the man, so far as the law of this territory is concerned. But I will tell you plain, he did not strike me as a man inclined to accept a refusal gracefully. Thought you ought to be prepared for that, and thought Gilbert here ought to know it too. Gilbert's hand had gone, almost without his noticing, to rest lightly against the small of Susan's back, a gesture of quiet support that did not go unnoticed by either Susan or the sheriff. "She will not be facing him alone," Gilbert said, his voice low but carrying an iron certainty that surprised even himself. "Whatever he has to say, he can say it to both of us." The confrontation came 2 days later, when Edgar Thorne, having grown tired of waiting for Susan to come to him in town, hired a horse and rode out to the Ramsey ranch himself, arriving in the late morning with the kind of confident swagger that Gilbert immediately, instinctively, distrusted. He was a tall man, well-dressed in a manner unsuited to ranch country, with a thin mustache and pale, calculating eyes, and he dismounted in the ranch yard with the air of a man accustomed to having his way in all matters. "Miss Langley," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy as Susan came out onto the porch, Gilbert a steady presence just behind her shoulder. "I confess I had expected you to come to me in town, rather than forcing me to make this journey myself. I trust your recovery has been thorough." "It has, Mr. Thorne, thank you," Susan said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter Gilbert could see in the way her hands twisted together at her waist. "Though I regret that I did not think it necessary to come to town, given that I have already sent word of my decision by letter, which I posted 3 days past." Thorne's expression flickered, a brief crack in his composed facade. "I received no such letter." "Then I expect it is still on its way, the mail being what it is in this territory," Susan said. "But I will tell you now, in person, what that letter says, so there can be no confusion between us. I cannot marry you, Mr. Thorne. I entered into our correspondence in a moment of great difficulty, believing it to be my only reasonable path forward, but circumstances have changed, and my feelings along with them. I will repay you every cent you spend on my passage west as soon as I am able, but I cannot and will not marry a man I do not love, and do not believe I ever could love, based on all that has passed between us." Thorne's face darkened, the courteous mask slipping further to reveal something colder and more calculating beneath. "I did not travel 200 miles for a lecture on love, Miss Langley. Our arrangement was practical, not romantic, and I fail to see what has changed that practicality." His pale eyes flicked then to Gilbert, standing solid and silent behind Susan's shoulder, and something like understanding and contempt crossed his features. "Ah, I see. The rescuer has become something more, has he? How very convenient for you both." "That is enough," Gilbert said quietly, stepping forward now to stand beside Susan rather than behind her, his voice carrying a warning that even Thorne, arrogant as he was, seemed to register. "You have heard the lady's answer, Mr. Thorne. I would suggest you accept it with whatever grace you can manage and return to Cheyenne. And who exactly are you to be giving me suggestions on my own business?" Thorne demanded, though there was a note of uncertainty creeping into his bluster now, faced with Gilbert's unmoving calm and considerable size. "Man who found her half dead in a snowbank," Gilbert said, "and who does not much care for the notion of a woman being spoken of like a debt owed, rather than a person with a mind and a heart of her own. Miss Langley has given you her answer. I would consider the matter closed, were I in your position." Thorne's jaw worked for a long moment, clearly torn between his wounded pride and the plain reality that he had no legal standing and no practical means of forcing the issue against a man built like Gilbert Ramsey on Gilbert Ramsey's own land. Finally, with a sound of disgust, he turned back toward his hired horse. "You will send the money you owe me, Miss Langley," he said stiffly, mounting up. I will expect it within the month, or I will pursue the matter through whatever legal means are available to me." "You will have it, Mr. Thorne," Susan said evenly, "every cent and not a moment later than promised. Good day." They watched him ride off down the trail toward Bitter Creek, his back rigid with affronted dignity, until he disappeared over a low rise, and only then did Susan allow the tension to leave her shoulders, a shaky breath escaping her as she turned to find Gilbert already watching her with an expression of such open tenderness that it stole whatever words she might have offered. "You did not have to stand with me like that," she said softly. "I could have faced him alone." "Did not want you to have to," Gilbert said simply. "Reckon I have grown rather fond of not letting you face hard things alone, Susan Langley, if you will permit me to keep on with the habit." It was, though neither of them remarked upon it at the time, the closest thing to a declaration either had yet spoken aloud, and it hung between them in the crisp morning air, full of unspoken promise. The weeks that followed Thorne's departure brought a new lightness to the ranch, a sense of settled possibility that neither Susan nor Gilbert had quite dared to hope for in the anxious days before. Susan took a position, at Mrs. Odell's suggestion, helping out at the Bitter Creek General Store a few days each week, both to earn the money she owed Thorne and, in truth, because the small independence of it felt good to her after so many months of feeling entirely at the mercy of circumstance. She boarded during those days with Mrs. Odell in town, preserving the proprieties, and rode back out to the Ramsey Ranch on the days she was not needed at the store, a routine that suited everyone well enough, though both Gilbert and Susan found themselves counting the hours until her return on the days she was away. It was during one such return, on a mild evening in early April, with the last patches of snow finally melting from the shadowed corners of the ranch yard, and the first green shoots of new grass pushing up through the mud, that Gilbert Ramsey finally found the courage to say what had been sitting, unspoken but unmistakable, in his chest for weeks. He met her at the gate as she rode in, helping her down from the borrowed horse with hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary at her waist, and something in the way he looked at her, in the deep and steady warmth of his dark eyes, made Susan's heart begin to beat faster even before he spoke a single word. "Susan," he said, and the use of her given name alone, without the formal Miss Langley he had clung to even in recent weeks, told her something important was coming. "I am not a man given to fine speeches, never have been, even before Mary passed, and less so since. But I find I cannot let another day go by without telling you plain what has been sitting in my heart since I pulled you out of that snowbank, and maybe even before that, though I did not have the sense to know it then." Susan's breath caught, and she found she could not speak, only nod for him to continue, her eyes bright with unshed tears in the fading golden light of evening. "I love you," Gilbert said, simply and without ornamentation, the words falling into the quiet ranch yard like stones into still water. "I have loved you, I think, since somewhere in those long nights I sat up watching you fight your way back from that fever, though I did not let myself name it as such until much more recently. I do not have much to offer you, Susan. A small ranch, a modest herd of cattle, a house that has known more grief than joy these past 2 years. But I would be honored, more honored than I know how to say, if you would consider making that house your home, and making me the happiest man in the Wyoming territory by agreeing to be my wife." For a moment Susan could do nothing but stare at him, her heart so full she feared it might burst from the sheer force of feeling contained within it, and then she laughed, a bright and joyful sound that seemed to startle even the horses in the corral, and threw her arms around Gilbert's neck. "Yes," she said, half laughing and half crying against his shoulder. "Yes, Gilbert Ramsey, 1,000 times yes, I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first night I woke and saw you standing by the door with your hat in your hands, though it took me nearly as long as it took you to admit it to myself." Gilbert's arms came around her then, strong and sure, and he held her close in the fading light, and when he finally drew back enough to look at her face, he kissed her, gently at first and then with all the pent-up longing of the weeks and months that had brought them to this moment. A kiss that Susan felt down to her very bones. A kiss that felt, in the truest sense of the word, like coming home. They were married 3 weeks later, in the small white church at Bitter Creek, on a bright Saturday morning in late April when the prairie grass had turned green and the wildflowers had begun to dot the hillsides in scattered patches of color. Nearly the whole town turned out for the occasion, for Bitter Creek was not so large a place that a wedding, particularly one with a story as remarkable as this one, could go unremarked, and there was scarcely a soul within 20 miles who had not heard some version of the tale of the widower who found a half-frozen stranger on the trail and carried her home, only to fall in love with her along the way. Susan wore a dress of pale blue muslin that Mrs. Odell had helped her sew from fabric purchased at the general store, simple but lovely, with a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered that very morning from the meadow behind the church. Gilbert wore his one good suit, the same one he had worn at his first wedding, though he had told Susan honestly, without any wish to cause her pain, that he did not think Mary would begrudge him this second chance at happiness. And Susan, who had come to understand the depth of the grief Gilbert carried, only kissed his cheek gently and told him that she believed the same. The Reverend Mr. Caldwell, who had taken over the small congregation some years back, spoke of the strange and providential ways in which love could find a person even in the harshest of circumstances, of storms that brought destruction but sometimes, too, brought forth unexpected blessings from within their wreckage. When he pronounced Gilbert Ramsey and Susan Langley husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause and cheerful shouts, and Sheriff Boone, standing near the back, was seen to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, though he would deny it fiercely if anyone dared to mention it later. The celebration that followed was held in the churchyard and continued long into the afternoon, with tables set up under the open sky bearing more food than the town had seen since the previous autumn's harvest festival, contributed by nearly every family in the district in a spontaneous outpouring of goodwill. There was music, too, a fiddle and a guitar played by 2 ranch hands who fancied themselves musicians, and dancing on the packed dirt of the churchyard that lasted until the stars came out overhead, bright and numerous, just as Susan had told Gilbert they always seemed out here on the open range. Mrs. Odell, watching the newly married couple share their first dance as husband and wife, turned to Sheriff Boone with a satisfied smile. "Never thought I would see that man smile again the way he is smiling right now," she said. "Not after what happened to Mary and the boy. It does a body good to see it." "Reckon that storm did them both a strange kind of favor in the end," Boone said, watching Gilbert twirl his new bride with a clumsy but earnest enthusiasm that drew laughter from the watching crowd, "though I would not recommend the method to anyone looking to find themselves a spouse." "No," Mrs. Odell agreed, laughing. "I do not suppose I would either." The years that followed brought their own share of hardship, as life on the frontier always did, but they brought far more joy than sorrow to the Ramsey ranch, and Susan often reflected, in the quiet moments of her days, on how strange and wonderful it was that the worst night of her life had led her, however circuitously, to the best years of it. Within a year of their marriage, Susan gave birth to a son, a healthy and robust boy they named Thomas, after Gilbert's own father, and Gilbert wept openly at the birth, tears of relief and joy mixed together, for the memory of Mary's fate had haunted the pregnancy despite Mrs. Odell's careful attendance, and the sound of his son's first strong cry was, Gilbert later told Susan, the sweetest sound he had ever heard in all his life. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Mary Grace, a choice that Susan herself suggested, wanting to honor the memory of the woman who had come before her, and Gilbert had been so moved by the gesture that he had been unable to speak for several long minutes, able only to hold his wife close and press a kiss to her hair in silent gratitude. The Ramsey Ranch prospered in the years that followed, growing from Gilbert's original small herd into one of the more respected cattle operations in the district, built through the combined hard work of husband and wife alike. For Susan proved herself as capable a partner in the practical business of ranching as she had shown herself to be in matters of the heart. She kept the books for the operation, her father's shopkeeping lessons proving unexpectedly useful, and she became known throughout Bitter Creek as a woman of considerable business sense as well as considerable kindness, often the first to organize aid for a struggling neighbor family or to nurse a sick child alongside Mrs. Odell, who remained a close and beloved friend to the family for the rest of her long life. Edgar Thorne, true to his word, pursued no further legal action once Susan sent him the full sum owed for her passage west, repaid in careful installments over the course of that first year of marriage, and the town of Bitter Creek heard no more of him beyond an occasional mention in the Cheyenne newspapers, where he continued his mercantile business, and some years later was reported to have married a widow of considerable means, a match that Susan, hearing the news, could only hope brought him whatever version of happiness a man of his temperament was capable of finding. On winter evenings in the years that followed, when the snow piled deep against the windows of the ranch house and the fire crackled warm in the hearth, Gilbert and Susan would sometimes tell their children the story of how they had met, of the terrible storm and the long, silent ride home, of the fever and the fear and the slow, unlikely blossoming of love between a grieving widower and a desperate young woman who had believed, that cold night on the trail, that her story was ending, when in truth it had only just begun. "Your papa did not say a single word to me the whole way home," Susan would tell young Thomas and Mary Grace, settling them onto her lap by the fire while Gilbert sat nearby mending harness or whittling some small toy for the children, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Not one word, the entire 6 miles. I was too far gone to know it at the time, of course, but Mrs. Odell told me later that your father carried me into this very house without saying a thing, just set to work building up the fire and warming me the best way he knew how. Did not seem the time for talking, Gilbert would say, looking up from his work with that same quiet warmth that Susan had come to treasure above all things in this world. Some things a man does not need words for. Saving a life is one of them. Falling in love with the woman whose life you saved, I have since learned, is another. And Susan, hearing this, would only smile and lean her head against his shoulder, grateful beyond words for the storm that had nearly taken her life, and for the silent cowboy who had found her in the depths of it, and carried her, without a single word, into the home and the family and the love that would fill the rest of her days. The ranch grew and changed with the passing years, as Bitter Creek itself grew from a small frontier outpost into a more settled town, with a proper schoolhouse eventually built where Thomas and Mary Grace, and later 2 more children who joined the Ramsey family in the years that followed, a second son named Walter and a second daughter named Ellen, all received their early education. Gilbert lived to see his eldest son grow into a capable young rancher in his own right, and Susan lived to see her daughters marry good men from neighboring ranches and raise families of their own. And in all the long years of their marriage, through droughts and hard winters and the ordinary trials of frontier life, neither Gilbert nor Susan ever forgot the storm that had brought them together, nor ceased to be grateful for the strange and terrible mercy of it. Susan Langley Ramsey lived out the whole of her long life on that same ranch outside Bitter Creek, growing old alongside the man who had found her half frozen and given up hope on a mountain trail, and carried her home without a word, only to fill the rest of her days with more words of love and tenderness than she had ever imagined possible for a woman who had once believed her only path forward lay in a loveless arrangement with a stranger. She would tell her grandchildren in her final years, sitting on the same porch where Gilbert had once proposed to her beneath the wide Wyoming sky, that the greatest lesson of her life had been this: that even in the coldest and most desperate hour, when all seemed lost and the future seemed nothing but darkness and snow, a person might yet be found and carried home and loved for the rest of their days, if only they had the courage to hold on until help arrived. And Gilbert Ramsey, for his part, though never a man of many words even in his old age, would simply take his wife's weathered hand in his own and press a kiss to it, and say, as he had said so many times over the decades of their marriage, that finding her on that trail had been the finest piece of luck to ever befall him, and that he would walk through 100 blizzards again, without a moment's hesitation, if it meant finding his way once more to Susan Langley and carrying her home, and loving her for the whole of his remaining days.